Right, so this meeting is being recorded. Thank you very much, Jiwon. Before we officially begin, we actually want to learn more about you. So we prepared some warm-up, ice-breaking questions. So our first question, if you're comfortable with sharing, please share with us your race/ethnicity. So are you Korean, Korean American? If you identify yourself of another race, ethnicity, please share. We would love to get to know more about you. So if you could write down in the chat, that would be wonderful. Korean American, Korean American. Oh, a lot of Korean Americans out there. 1.5, thank you for sharing your generation. 1.5 Jen, Korean American. Taiwanese American, welcome. Oh, this is great, this is great. Malaysian Chinese, oh, Chinese American 2.0. This is awesome. Oh, we love seeing some diversity here. Thank you, thank you. All right, well, please keep on sharing within the chat. It's so fun to learn about our audience. And I think it's also fun for the audience to learn who's here joining us today. But okay, now I want to actually move on to the next question. And this question is, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about entering this conversation on healing from collective trauma in the Korean American community today? Give a few seconds for people to process. Yeah, excited, thankful for this time and space indeed. Curiosity, feeling sad, overwhelmed, but hopeful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, please continue to share. We really appreciate your transparency with this, and we hope we can continue this sense of transparency throughout our discussion today. And I hope everybody here would feel welcomed, listened, and belonged, because that's our goal for today. Now, I'm happy to actually introduce and invite our discussants for today. Our four discussants right here, they are our very own MSG board members, but also mental health professionals who served in this field for so many years. I have the huge pleasure to introduce and invite our discussants. First, we have Dr. Josephine Kim, who's a licensed mental health counselor. We have Ms. Jessica Kim, who's a licensed clinical social worker. We have Megan Kwon, who's a licensed marriage and family therapist. And lastly, we have Dr. Samuel Kim, who's a licensed specialist in school psychology. Thank you so much, discussants, for joining us in this space today. And yeah, I'm now happy to invite everyone to unmute themselves, turn on their cameras, and yeah, please feel free to take it away from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, for that lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. It's so great to see you. You want to take a few deep breaths while you're here? Please, if you find yourself feeling a little bit overwhelmed, definitely take a stretch break, take some deep breaths. I think that's so important. But yeah, I mean, we really envision that we are sitting around the fireplace just amongst, friends and people who just want to share what's on our hearts. And so for me, I don't know about the other discussants, but when I've been thinking about this collective healing, I can't help but also think about the collective trauma, right? But what we also know is that when there is something that's collectively such a struggle, that it really does require a collective healing. Yes, there are things that we can do on our own as well, but it's also important to try to do the healing together. And so I'm really grateful to be here. So yeah, let me ask the discussants, friends, so good to see you. One of the first things that I'm wondering about, again, as friends, what's kind of been on top of mind for you, especially when you saw that, this is a healing community for Asian Americans and et cetera. Mika, what about you?
I really appreciate this space. I think I want to start with that because I was just telling the fireside chatters right before we started how important it is to give voice to our pain. Sometimes it can be really cathartic and healing to even hear someone else express what's already on our hearts. And so that's really one of the hopes that I have for our space together, that it could be a healing experience simply by hearing our hearts and giving space, giving permission for our hearts to be heard. But for me, I'm really heartbroken by the recent shootings, Tyre Nichols, Michigan State shootings, and then I think especially closer to home for our Asian American community are the shootings in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay. I used to live in Pasadena, which is about half an hour from Monterey Park, and I have clients who were directly connected with some of the victims. So I've actually been walking with them through just a lot of grief. So I feel like this really hit close to home. So part of me, I feel like I'm kind of in hypervigilant mode, like I'm bracing myself for the next tragedy. I don't know if any of you guys feel that way too. And then another part of my heart is just numb, just so hard. But Sam, what about you?
Yeah, it's been such a horrible time with all of these shootings that are happening in so many different places, and to even think about how people who look like me are being victims of a lot of these attacks. It's things that I never imagined when I was growing up. As a school psychologist, one of the things that's always on my mind is, and I was having this conversation with a friend of mine recently, it's after the Michigan State shooting. I remember I was having a discussion. I thought, I never thought how dangerous a profession as an educator would be, as it is now, to always kind of think about what could happen tomorrow. And with the number of shootings that have happened in schools, even across so many different places, both in urban areas and rural areas, it's just you just don't know when anything's going to happen in any given place. And that's something that's been weighing down on me. At the same time, one of the things that's always important to me, especially when a lot of these things are kind of burdened on me, is the people around me. It's, who are my social supports? Who are the people I lean on when, things are not going well? And it's times like this that I make sure to reach out to friends, I reach out to family. And one of my New Year's resolutions has been to be generous with how thankful I am for the people, and to just let people know how appreciative I am of them in my life, because I don't want to miss an opportunity to not say that to those around me. So Jess, what's been weighing on your mind recently?
A lot, but I'm just kind of noticing right now how my heart is beating faster, and I'm feeling just a lot of overwhelm right before we started entering the space. And it made me realize I had kind of disconnected from this for a couple of weeks. And now that we're engaging in this conversation, it feels like it's rushing back again. So I'm just kind of noticing what's going on in my body right now. And unlike Migam, I know you said this was very close to home for you, right? This didn't feel very close to home for me. Actually, I'm on the East Coast. I don't know anybody in Monterey Park or Half Moon Bay. And so, when I first heard about these events, my initial inclination was, oh, okay. And just to put it down and set it aside and try to go about my day. But of course, in the coming days, I was trying to process this more. And I think it definitely has impacted me. And I think that kind of speaks to this collective trauma piece, right? That even though I'm not directly impacted by this, I don't know anybody who was harmed. I don't know anybody in those areas. It still impacts me, right, as an Asian American person. And that's kind of, I guess, how the mechanisms of collective trauma can work. And I guess what's been really on my mind are a couple of things. I noticed what I was really thinking about that first week was how I thought this was kind of a wake-up call for us as a community. For me, it was kind of like I was ready to debunk this false assumption that Asian Americans are somehow not capable of this kind of violence. I think intellectually we know, right? Yeah, Asian Americans, we're not immune, to trauma. We're not immune to the effects of poverty or alcoholism or substance misuse. We know that in our heads, right? But that's how pervasive the model minority myth is, I think, in our collective consciousness as a country, that I think even as Asian Americans in our community, we're susceptible to these biases. So I think if we're honest, we weren't expecting the shooters to be of Asian descent, right? That was kind of a surprise when we learned that. And, we have to grapple with this now. Like, what does this mean? So I've been kind of thinking about that. I think it kind of broke this threshold in our minds of what we thought was conceivable. So in that sense, it was a wake-up call, a much needed one at that. I think it's long overdue that we take seriously the mental health and well-being of our community. I mean, I really hope that these horrific massacres, really is what they were, won't be in vain. That instead it would help us to respond by trying to confront what's going on with us. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I mean, I think so far what I'm hearing from everyone is we know our own limits sometimes, and sometimes we really can't engage in the work of completely engaging in something just because you don't have the capacity. And I think sometimes we do have to compartmentalize just to function and survive in life. I know I've been doing that quite a bit. For me, I realize my mind is all over the place, and literally from, I think I've got the headline stress disorder, which is a new thing these days because there are just so many headlines. My heart is weeping for people in Turkey and Syria. I'm still weeping over the anti-Asian racism and sentiments. I'm still, grieving, I feel like collectively, even with the Black community as they're celebrating Black History Month, thinking of our parallel experiences, the massacres that our community has experienced. We don't associate words like lynching, right? Segregation, those types of things, policing even. We don't associate those words with the Asian American communities, but it's all in our history. And I think another layer of the pain is that it's always so invisible, like nobody will talk about it. And when we don't talk about it, it's so gaslighting, like it's never happened to your community. And not only that, you really don't have a right to then grieve and feel like you're at a loss for something when nobody even acknowledges that all those things happened. And so I think for me, it's realizing that these events that are happening, they're not in isolation, but they're really just compounding upon each other. And it's like, where do you start? Right. I'm seeing in the chat here, Sean, thank you for being here. Really appreciating what you just shared in the chat. If people have questions or thoughts, please, we invite you in the chat because we want to make sure that we actually acknowledge, what you're sitting with and what you're bringing as well. But one other thing that I want to kind of ask my colleagues here, we talk often when it comes to mental health about youth, maybe even families. We rarely talk about the mental health of our elderly. And we, in fact, know actually in the Asian American communities that depression, that even suicide attempts, right? I mean, overall, generally for most elders, just across, the nation, it's a thing. But I know within the Asian American communities, if you can think about life development and where you might be in your 60s, 70s, and 80s, for some of us, we've got parents, right, who are those ages and watching how they evolve through life. And for me, I see my parents a few times a year, if I'm lucky, maybe once a year, right, at most. And every time I see them, of course, I see just how much they've aged. I also see these small attempts they're now making to kind of put the bows on different things, right? Because they're really feeling like they now need to close up parts of their lives and get ready, right? Because the least thing they want to do is leave messy, open things for their children. And I actually see this, even though they don't explicitly talk about it. And it does a number, right, on us as children. What about all of you? Ooh.
I guess I'll go thinking about parents and family. So I live in Denver, Colorado, but my family's out in Georgia. It's a small town in Georgia, so nowhere near Atlanta. And my parents live near my grandmother and my uncle, and watching my parents, getting a little bit older, it kind of makes me start to think a little bit too. It's only been in recent years that I learned a new Korean word that I've never heard in my life, which is yusan, which is like inheritance. I'm like, oh, that's a word. Why do I know this word now? But I think one of the things that strikes me more than seeing my parents get older is my grandmother getting older, because she did raise me for a good portion of my childhood, and just watching her having a harder time with mobility, having a harder time following conversations and things. It's heartbreaking. And I know that in the evening she sees the news every day, and so I know she's watching like all these things happening at various places across the country. And it's one of those things, because we grew up where we don't talk about hardships. We don't talk about things that burden us. And even though I'm a professor, I'm a mental health professional, I've been in this field for years, I still don't know how to bring this up with my grandmother to kind of see like, how is she handling this? How is she processing this? And there's that weird block that's right there that I just don't really know how to navigate. And I mean, my Korean's not the best, but I have enough language skills to be able to have that conversation with her. But for some reason, I do find it difficult to have it with her.
Gosh, sorry, I may be going off on a tangent here, but when you were talking about not knowing how to have these conversations, yeah, it just really, makes me think about all these, I guess I'll call it ambiguous losses from all of the lost conversations. What I mean by that is the conversations we were never able to have with our parents or with our grandparents, not because they weren't physically in front of us, but because the language just wasn't there. I mean, I know enough Korean to get by, but I'm a deep communicator. I love having really deep, nuanced conversations about things, and I can't do that with my parents. And so I agree with that. Yeah.
One thing I'm really thankful for is that being out in Southern California, so I was on faculty at Fuller, and so just being in that Southern California location actually set us up to receive a lot of training on how to work with elders, especially the Asian American community of elders, the elderly, because we have like one of the highest populations. And, like Dr. Joe was saying, such a high prevalence of depression, anxiety, isolation from their family members. And it's really heartbreaking. But especially with the pandemic, I feel like I've seen the level of fear, like direct fear. Will I be hurt? I don't think I've seen that on like a larger scale of our grandparents, our elderly, fearing for their lives and their safety. And that's kind of hit the community, I think, in a different way. So I recently, I think just in the past like year or two, I've actually had my clients ask me to see their parents for therapy. Partly because there's already like a background, there's history, but although my Korean isn't that great, there's something about the elderly needing a safe space. Like Sam was saying, they need a safe space to share, just to know that like someone who is listening understands their culture and is giving them a safe space to share. So for all the mental health professionals out there, if your Korean doesn't have to be that good, I feel like even just like opening up that space and understanding the person feel heard and seen and known, I feel like that's healing enough. So even if you're a little uncomfortable, I encourage you to get out of your comfort zones and give it a try. Yeah, because it's so needed, especially outside of California. Yeah.
I love it. I'm teaching a course. It's called Contemporary Issues in Asian America. It's the first ever ethnic studies course at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in 103 years, I just want to say. So it's been really exciting. But one of the things that the students do is what's called a talk story. It's basically oral histories. And it's interviewing, somebody in their lives. Usually they end up interviewing their parents. And inevitably, in any time during the semester, somebody will ask, well, how about when your parents refuse to have these conversations because anything negative feels so shameful, right? They just don't want to talk about it or even name it, recognize it, acknowledge it, because it just is so associated with shame. And so even today during class, we talked about, sometimes, especially in light of Black History Month, we were trying to think about the parallel experiences, in both of our communities. And honestly, the beast we're fighting is white supremacy all across the board, right? Which conveniently removes itself, so you don't actually see the beast. You end up fighting each other, which is what we often see in the news as well. But one of the pieces we talked about is, when you don't have the emotional capacity because you are so wounded, because you're so wounded, there isn't that emotional capacity to empathize with other people, right? So maybe one of the first things we can do for the elderly, and let's just admit it, holidays can be so hard for anybody, but when your internal state doesn't match the celebrations of the Lunar New Year, which is so huge in our communities, then that juxtaposition of not feeling so, like celebratory, but then everybody celebrating around you, that can be such a stark contrast and such a harsh reality. So this idea came up, what if we created opportunities for our parent generation, our grandparent generations, to offload some of their wounds first, right? To really listen to their stories first, to hold their stories with the honor and the respect that it deserves. And I told the students, if there's a hint of disrespect, conversation's over. So be mindful of that, right? But let's encourage them and invite them. And for me, I've done it with my own father, where conversation was just not a thing, right, with him. But I remember starting with things like, I never really knew my grandfather. Can you tell me a little bit about what your dad was like? I don't know what it was like when you went to school. Can you tell me a little bit about when you were a child? And those conversations felt a little bit, like step removed and a little bit safer. So my dad would go on and on and on with these stories. But it was only then that we could actually visit some of the stuff I was carrying from our relationship. But it really wasn't until I offered that space first for him to kind of talk about his own wounds. And then it created a little bit of that emotional capacity to then be able to sit with my stuff, right? And other people's pain too.
I love that,
just
Joe.
wondering.
I think it's helpful when, when it comes to like, how do we talk to our parents, when we approach it with, I don't know, more realistic expectations. Maybe I think we can oftentimes get really discouraged when we feel like we finally work up the courage to have this conversation about something difficult, and then the conversation doesn't really go as we expected that it would, and then we just kind of decide, oh, it's a lost cause. I think we need to maybe look at it more as a process, like as a series of little micro dialogues over time, not this like one-off conversation that's dramatic or revolutionary. And as you were talking, I was thinking about how I'm sure all of us are familiar with genograms, right? At some point in our training as therapists. For those of you who have never heard of that before, a genogram can be a useful tool that it's sort of like if you could think of a family tree, but it's like a family tree on steroids, let's say, right? It's much more than just a family tree. It's a visual diagram that, it can span like 3 to 4 generations, and you're mapping things like relationship statuses, right? Emotional connections between members, status of mental illness or physical illness, lots of things, really, anything you want. But I think it could be a nice tool, especially if you're, I think it could be helpful because if you approach your parent with this, like I remember I did this in graduate school. This was like over 20 years ago. It was nice to have this assignment, right? Oh, Appa, I have this assignment that I have to do, right? And it's sort of this concrete thing that you have in front of you, the both of you, and it creates some distance. It kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? Objectifies maybe whatever emotions or things that you're trying to address, and it helps to direct both of your attention to this piece of paper instead. And you get to ask questions about, family members and then sort of map it on there. And it's just a safe, less threatening way, I think, to engage our parents around some of these difficult conversations. I remember I learned like stories about my dad's childhood, stories about relatives I didn't even know I had. I'd never heard them being mentioned before. Even some like family secrets came to the surface after, like decades of silence. It was really very eye-opening. I think it could be a really powerful window into the past, and maybe a good way to maybe consider engaging our parents. So I did want to mention that.
I want to share an experience that I had. I kind of went about starting some conversations in my family, but I did it in sort of a sneaky way. So last year I had a cousin who was getting married, and so a lot of our family got together, and we all got together. Our family was staying together at like one Airbnb. And while we were there, I have cousins there, extended cousins, and let me tell you, every time our family gets together, they always ask me, so how are we related? So how are we family? And I tell them every time we get together, and I thought, okay, this is ridiculous. I need to just like create a family tree so that I can just show them how we're together. And I thought, well, wait a second. All the family members are here. My grandmother's here. My father, mother, uncles, aunts are all here. And I thought, I went up to one of them. I said, hey, where's our family chokbok, the ancestral family book that shows like where our family tree and stuff is? And you're like, oh, we have no idea where it is. And it's like, okay, I want to create a new family tree for us. Can you tell us like who grandma's siblings were, who were grandpa's siblings, like how is everyone related? And I started writing it down. Of course, we had no paper there. And so I literally started writing this on paper towels with a pen. And I cannot tell you the number of stories that just started coming out because everyone started coming into the kitchen and started contributing to different things. And, my grandmother, who was not as involved in some of these conversations, would come over and be like, 아니, 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 그 사람 아니었었어. 거의 오빠였었어. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's like, okay, we're writing down new names now. And it's just so interesting, like just I felt like starting the family tree gave me a roadmap to start asking some questions. And there were so many stories that came out. Like I found out that my great grandfather had 2 wives, and the
Mhm.
stories of like how the first wife passed away early on, married a
Mhm.
second wife, and then he passed away. And then his second wife said, no, bury him with his first wife because that's his first love.
Wow.
And what I learned later, oh my gosh, I'm going to get teary-eyed from the rest of the story.
Mhm.
Learned later is that when the second wife passed away, so my great grandmother, my family apparently created like a very big, almost shrine-like gravesite or something for her to really commemorate her and to honor her, especially with the way that she was honoring the family and that she took care of the family. I mean, stories like that were coming out, and I just thought,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, none of my cousins know about these stories. None of my
Mhm.
other relatives know about this. And it's like, if we don't ask about these things, these could get lost. And so, yeah, the family tree was my start. I just started asking questions. And
Mhm.
let me just say, if any of you decide to do this, be ready for lots of answers.
Mhm.
I love it. And you know, in therapy, right? I mean, this is exactly why we use art. This is why we use expressive therapies. This is why we use activities, because it's a step removed. And as Jess was saying, it gives you enough of a distance that it's easier to talk about that circle on that paper instead of saying like me, right? And so these tools, I mean, that's where they come in so handy. I will never forget, you know, my maternal grandmother. I mean, admired her in so many ways, but there was always a pervasive kind of sadness about her, even from my childhood recollections. And it wasn't until I understood what her name was, and her name in Korean is Lee So-un, which literal translation is disappointment Lee, because she was born a girl. I
Wow.
know. And when I heard this, it was like,
Wow.
okay, I can see where that pervasive and prolonged kind of
Mhm.
weeping and just this always kind of like dysthymia a little bit, like a low grade depression that would just surround her all throughout her life. And I remember even as a child picking up on that and saying something, you know, yes, like all her faculties are there, but something is very just sad about my grandmother. But I mean, even that alone, right? But I also want to offer, you know, so many things may feel associated with shame, but when things are erased, like all these histories, when they get erased, I think one of the most dangerous pieces about that is we also don't get to hear the stories of resilience and the strength and the immense, you know, accomplishments that are, yeah, our former generations. We're standing on their shoulders, and we lose those stories too.
And I'm
Yes.
wondering,
Oh, go ahead, Megan. I'm sorry.
it's a quick thought. I wonder if as we're able to get these stories, good, bad, ugly, all of those, that the act of sharing actually not only brings healing, but erases some of that shame too. Right. The act, because we're as an Asian culture, wow, there's so much shame, the secrets you can't share. But as they come out, there's almost like an embracing, at least that's been my experience with my own family. Like there's this embracing of, okay, that happened. That's part of our family. That happened. You know, and we actually end up rallying around rather than actually shaming each other.
Mm. Yeah, shame loses its power when it's out in the open. In fact, you know, this is why counseling and therapy is so effective, but essentially what's effective about it is that we're actually, as you said, unveiling those things like the shroud of shame. And research will actually say the thing that you're trying to hide is more stressful, right? Or the act of trying to hide that thing is more stressful than the thing you're actually trying to hide. So this act of hiding it, actively trying to hide it, is the thing that's really stressing us all out. Sam, were you going to share something earlier?
Yes, and it kind of left me for a second. So I've been trying to bring it back. But talking about those stories, oh my gosh, I see the power in stories, and just I love it when my family I can get them to tell the stories like I did with the family tree, and just listening to people's stories. there's so many things that you can see and understand. And even when I see clients, I always start off the first session by telling them, I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. I'm not here to tell you what you're doing wrong or right. I'm here to really go on a road trip through your life, and you're driving and I'm sitting in the passenger seat. And I'm just going to ask questions of things that I see along the way. And from there, I found that a lot of my clients are just starting to tell me stories of things that they're going through, stories of their past. And interestingly enough, stories that they want to hear. So stories of like certain family members, stories of their past that they were trying to discover. And it's a question of like, how do we get into those, and what does it mean to find those, and what could it mean if you never find those? And it's a journey. Like, stories have so much power.
Mhm.
And I wonder if uh, one of the things that we can do is to create spaces to hear those stories. Now, of course, as therapists, we do that all the time. But what about a church? What would it look like to have a time? I know there's the testimony time, but what could there be other spaces where we can talk more about like our families? Or could we create spaces even in our workplace? So, for example, one of my friends, she works right in Monterey Park. So the incident happened, and she was, she's Chinese American. There was just a lot of emotions, and there were other Asian folks on staff. And so she wanted to create a space where they could talk about it, and her white boss did not feel a need to do so. I was like, why? And so she really stepped up, used her voice, and basically demanded that space be given. And there was such good sharing of stories, and a sharing of heart. And all the Asian staff afterwards were like, thank you for going out on a limb to create that space for us. Because not just for them, but also for their non-Asian colleagues, there would be an opportunity for them to hear and understand. So I really feel like this could be an opportunity for us to speak up, because we can be change makers within our circles, to help name when there's systemic inequities, microaggressions, even the microaggression of the boss saying, no, not necessary, right? Racism, violence. I feel like speaking up brings awareness and also gives us permission, like it gives permission for others to speak up when we speak up.
Yeah, actually, a church sister actually brought to my attention that Peter Scazzaro is trying to get churches to do genograms. So it's actually in the back of my mind, which is why I was thinking about it before. So this is something actually we're going to be trying to do in my church as well, at least starting with the leadership and trying to get our leaders engaged in doing a family genogram, in hopes that having a greater awareness of our family of origin and some of the intergenerational patterns, right, of behaving, and trying to look at what it is that maybe we've inherited, so that we can be more self-aware and be more emotionally healthy as leaders and as a church. So that's our hope. But I'm excited the fact that there is a pastor who has, endorsed this kind of secular concept, right? The secular tool that we've known about for decades, right? But now we see that churches are starting to be interested in this and see the value of it, and are trying to integrate this. So to your point about bringing this into church spaces, I think that that's a great way, a great concrete tool to maybe consider, for those listening who are maybe thinking of what they might want to do, let's say in their church spaces.
And I want to push back on that, Jess. We say that the genogram's like a newer tool, but something like that has existed within Christianity. Like, just looking at I mean, how do like some of the books in the New Testament start? It's just a whole lineage of people like, talking
Yeah,
about right there. And
absolutely.
what's great about it is the Bible contains stories of like all of those people in there. And so we're just taking some of those tools in a modern form and using it for our own lives. So in a
Mhm.
sense, one could argue we're being biblical. Am I allowed to say that? By doing things like this.
I agree.
I want to bring attention to a couple of the comments that are in the chat box. Yeah, the power of validating instead of shaming. I mean, I think one of the times that I feel most uncomfortable sharing something from me is if I've run into or the possibility of like becoming shamed. But oh my gosh, if I share a story and someone embraces it and someone actually validates it, it's so empowering. Um, and then I see Paul here has written about, how it can be difficult as a parent to approach a child. It's like, how do I impart some of these things to my child? How do I impart values or even some of these stories? And, that's a big challenge too.
Whew. Yes.
I've,
Oh my
I've actually,
goodness. The,
oh, go
no,
ahead.
go ahead, Mika. No,
Oh,
you.
say like just something really practical. So, when we go on family vacation, we're all in the car, we're all waiting in the airport. Like I'll actually take the initiative and say, "Hey, Appa," to my dad, "can you share this story of your childhood to my son who's 17?"
Oh,
So I'll
Mhm.
initiate that because we're killing time. And so my dad will share all sorts of stories because he was born in 1950 when the Korean War happened. So he has early traumatic memories of the war.
Mhm.
And so those stories, age appropriate for my son. But I've been doing this since my kiddo was little. And so my dad would just share little snippets like, how do you catch a rat? Sorry, how do you catch a rabbit and basically defur it? Very interesting that my son was like, wow, that's so cool. But these are things my son will like remember. He'll remember these stories. And that's what I'm hoping is that, I'll be able to prompt my parents to share these stories.
Sounds like your dad's a good storyteller, which I think helps to
Yeah.
keep the attention of a young person.
One thing I try to do, Paul, and hopefully this is helpful. I think with my child, I'm always thinking about the counter narratives that I could be presenting to my child, just because we know how this society is structured and who's kind of at the top and what kinds of messages he's trying to, definitely feel about himself, but also the really negative and damaging, messages that over time you just internalize and you don't even know. Oftentimes we do it even for survival, right? Just to get along and fit in and kind of make it through the day. And so at home, being very intentional about, wow, look at the strengths of Koreans and Korean Americans who have come before us, and I'll try to insert some creative stories. I mean, we've got BTS on our side these days. And so, I mean, something I certainly didn't have as a child. If I saw a Hyundai, driving by, I would try to like disassociate from it as much as I could, and I think a lot of us did that. But I think we're living in a time where there's so much to be proud of, but also being realistic about, our vulnerabilities too, right? That there are things that we don't talk about and that actually hurts us. That there are things that we don't prepare our children with, and that again, that actually hurts us. And I think for me, I also try to draw those parallels between other groups that are oppressed and saying this isn't just our story, but this is really kind of the human story. And you'll see a lot of it, right? And so, your idea of how do we kind of produce this ethnic pride of your, Korean American or Chinese American or whichever one you belong to, but also talking about the importance of seeing yourself as a global citizen so that when they do see what's happening in Turkey, that it actually does something to them too, right? Even though they may not be directly impacted by that. But it's a hard one, something I always try to think about.
I know we've
Jess,
been
I know you
talking.
got 3 children too. Oh, go ahead, Sam.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, I was just thinking Jess has 3 kids, so I'm wondering what might be in her repertoire of tools.
Oh gosh, we only have 10 minutes left. Don't get me started on all the issues. Sam, what were you going to say?
It was slightly unrelated to that. I was just talking. I was just thinking about how stories are a way to humanize one another, because it's so easy to dehumanize one another.
Mhm.
When I was doing work in cyberbullying and in that research literature, we talk about how in the cyber world, it doesn't seem like you're talking to a real person. And so it's much easier to say really nasty things on there that you would never say to an actual human being. And oftentimes when I've thought about like, do I have certain like prejudicial views, or do I have certain discriminatory views against someone or a certain group? And what I realize is, oh, I don't really know the stories of these people. I don't know the stories of certain groups. I don't know the stories of my neighbor. I don't know the stories of my coworker. And as I get to know them, like I have lunch with them or coffee with them, and they tell me about their lives, it's almost like they just kind of come into like, they were kind of in that like black and white TV, and now they're in HD. It's like I see them in a whole new light, and I see them as human beings, and I can connect with them. And sure, we may have disagreements on stuff, but I now see them as a human being just like me, and I understand we're both trying to figure out life in our own way.
I love what you said about just being vigilant about all the things that can dehumanize us. I think one of those things is um, being numb to things. I think staying in collective numbness and apathy is what contributes to us dehumanizing each other. I think it's what's going to destroy us as a society if we stop caring. And so I think we have to resist this temptation to be numb. It's so natural, I think. It's a common response that I think so many of us have when we're faced with something tragic, or we read some like horrific headline. It's very natural to get into that freeze mode, right? Into where we dissociate and kind of detach, because it's just our body's way of trying to survive something that would be too horrific really to fully feel in that moment. I know that there are days when I have to choose not to look at the news or consume any media, because I simply will not be able to function for the rest of the day if I just let myself fully get immersed. I'd be in tears. I'd be wrecked to just fully, get into all the details over and over again. So there's a certain degree of distance that I think is not a bad thing, right? To maintain our jobs, run our households, right? Preserve our mental health. But I think there's a difference between being mindful of our boundaries, versus defaulting to this numbness and apathy in this kind of like unconscious way, just because we can't deal, let's say, right? As long as we keep telling ourselves, oh, this would never happen to me, or that could never happen to my family, or that could never happen, in my neighborhood, or to my race, or to my religion, or whatever it is. And I think that's what was so critical about these recent mass shootings, right? To see that Asian Americans are not immune to things like this, to trauma, to violence, to isolation and hopelessness. These are, universal human conditions that we all need to care about if we're going to try to make things better. So, resisting that temptation to be numb, I think, is really, really important. It's hard to feel, though, right? Sometimes it's a lot easier to say than do. But I think you touched on this, Joe, earlier. I forget what you were saying, but as therapists, we know in our work, when it comes to helping our clients feel difficult feelings, the more we resist, the more it persists, right? And so much of the work that we do with our clients is helping them to feel their emotions, to understand their emotional world. So I think that's where we need to start, really, is to feel.
But I think it's also important to realize, sometimes the adolescents I work with, they'll hear a hurtful comment, and some of them will it'll devastate them. And other students are like, whatever,
Mhm.
right? So, I mean, of course, that has a lot to do with personalities, that has a lot to do with a lot of things, but it also has to do with your condition at that moment, right? So if you're vulnerable, if you're particularly feeling vulnerable, those types of events and things that we're seeing on the news will hurt you a lot more. It'll impact you deeply. Whereas if you're in a kind of a decent condition, it may not hurt you as much. You know what I mean? So I think one thing I really want to stress is really approaching mental health as a long-term hygiene. Right. This means, when we think of hygiene, what are we saying? You don't take 2-hour showers to recover from something, right? We're talking 5-minute showers, but doing it regularly, brushing your teeth twice a day, 2 minutes each time. These little things that we can do to maintain our mental health in its optimal state actually then will serve us as a protective factor when these things come up that are so unexpected and so traumatic. And so if we can keep that in mind, I think that would be so helpful. And I'm hearing from all four of us, sometimes it's not even about getting people to therapy, but it's about having these therapeutic conversations, even without therapy, right? Creating these opportunities. And they can be very therapeutic with the validating and just holding each other's pain. Sometimes you don't know what to say when somebody's experiencing pain, and there's nothing more healing than to just sit in the pain together. And sometimes that's in silence. Maybe that's our cue to stay silent. But yeah, maybe as we close, just our fireside chat, I'm wondering, maybe just in one sentence, where it is that you draw your strength, especially during these times. And would love to invite everyone who's here to share in the chat as well. Where do you draw your strength from, especially during these tough times? Yeah, singing songs, biblical truth. Nature, going outside, taking a break. Deep breathing. If you want to tame that anxiety, you got to tame the body, right? Love from my son, grace from God. It's beautiful.
I take a walk with my parents, about an hour walk, once or twice a week. And
Love that.
we share, talk, what's on our hearts. I love my parents. They're just amazing. And just hearing their perspective on things because of their lived experience, and the ways that they encourage me and my sisters and my son. So much strength there, and very, faith-based advice and encouragement.
Kiana says, engaging in spaces like these because it reminds me I'm not alone in what I'm feeling, seeing, etc. That's right. Remembering our work has purpose, good memories, stories, thoughts about family, similar to what Mika is saying, being present with my community.
Yeah, I think just remembering that we're not alone. And I think probably part of that is what we're trying to do here, even in the fireside chat, is to say we have a collective experience, we're not alone.
And if you might be struggling, of course you are. It'd be strange for us not to be struggling at these times. Of course, we're all struggling. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much, discussants, for opening up this very timely and needed conversation. Even by just listening from your conversations, I think it really helped us process our own thoughts and feelings just on the recent tragedies in our community, and helped us learn some ways to start conversations on pain and resilience within our own circles, especially within our families. So, and I would also like to thank our audience for participating today. We are grateful for your presence. we're glad that you're here to share what we're feeling together. And we hope everyone had a dose of healing and encouragement from our time today. So we actually want to share some MSG resources with you, and we'll wait a few seconds for slides. Awesome. Yeah, the first resource that we want to share is our bilingual online directory of mental health professionals. So if you visit our website, Mustard Seed Generation website, or the link, which will be shared in the chat in a moment, you can view Korean American mental health professionals in the States. So please feel free to check it out, share with those around you. These are, and there's this list of incredible MHPs that you can that have easy access to. And we also want to share an opportunity that's coming very soon, and that is our mental health training program for Korean American church leaders. This is a 7-week paid course that consists of online lectures and small group discussions led by a mental health professional. If you're a small group leader or church staff member, pastor, or a leader in the church, this is a great opportunity for you to learn some very important topics relevant to the KA community. So marriage conflict, mental health of Korean American youth, depression, suicide ideation, anger management, all in the context of Korean and Korean American churches. So early bird registration opens next week, and we'll be releasing the registration link next week. So we hope you could join us. It's gonna be amazing. And lastly, we want to share, if you found events like today very needed, we hope you could consider supporting us so that we can continue to create those spaces to talk about mental health. And we have volunteer opportunities opening very soon. So you could join us through your time and talents. We will be thrilled to have you join us with the work that we do here. So thank you so much, everyone, again, for your time. Again, we hope this event has left you feeling a bit of a rest, but I think everybody's so brave for just being here in this space to listen to these conversations and share those conversations. So we're so grateful for you. Thank you for joining us and allowing this space for us to talk about this. We hope you all have a good night, have a good rest of your day. And yeah, we'll see you again in our next event. Thank you so much, everyone.